small group of converts. His followers came to be known as Muslims, which means those who submit to God. Muhammad's message appealed especially to the city's poor and underprivileged, who heard their own lives echoed in the verse's pleas for social justice, that slaves should be freed, and that the rich and powerful should give charity to the needy. Some converts to the Qur'an's message were seduced by the beauty of the language itself, which they saw as so perfect, it must be evidence of God's existence.
When Muslims are asked, well, all right, what proof have you got that this is a divine revelation? Muslims will answer, and they have answered this over 1,000 years, the proof is the Qur'an itself. That is the miracle, that an illiterate man in the middle of nowhere suddenly produces this magnificent, powerful document.
But not everyone was enchanted with Muhammad's preaching. His provocative message, which refused to recognize the divinity of the idols kept in the Kaaba, infuriated the ruling Quraysh tribe and threatened its position of power.
And if you needed nothing to stand between you and this God, then there's no reason for the idols. And if there's no reason for the idols, then there's no reason for the Kaaba. And if there's no reason for the Kaaba, then there's no reason for Mecca's ascendancy as this social and economic capital of the Arabian Peninsula. So the conflict that the Quraysh had with Muhammad and these revelations was not a theological conflict. It was an economic conflict. It was a political conflict.
The Quraysh and the Meccan majority had little tolerance for the several dozen followers of Muhammad's message. The Muslims were brutally persecuted. Some were beaten in the streets, others tortured. For 9 years, the new Muslims endured the abuse, never wavering from their belief that there was, quote, no God but God. Muhammad himself was protected by his wealthy wife and powerful uncle. But when they died, the Prophet and his followers realized they had little choice but to flee Mecca.
The social fabric had been so shredded to the point that he did not feel that he would be able to physically continue in his mission in Mecca, and that he would have to begin to search for some kind of alternative base of operation.
With a new location would come a new kind of message in the Quran. An emphasis on law and a doctrine for war. For 12 years, beginning in 610 AD, Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad received God's revelations and preached them in the Arabian city of Mecca. But life for Muhammad's growing group of followers became increasingly dangerous there. City leaders rejected the Muslim belief in only one God, viciously persecuted believers, and put a bounty on the Prophet's head. Then, in the year 622, Muhammad's luck would turn with an invitation from some out-of-towners.
A group of people from a neighboring oasis came to Mecca looking for someone to arbitrate a dispute they were having. Muhammad, as a prophet, was considered to be an ideal person for this job. And eventually they agreed to take in not only Muhammad and his family, but also a whole group of these Muslims.
Gradually, clandestinely, the small Muslim community made its way 250 miles north to Yathrib, a city which would from then on be called Medina, the city of the Prophet. With a new location came a new position for Muhammad.
Whereas at one point he was a prophet, merely the conduit of God's words flowing through him, in Medina he becomes a leader. His community of Muslims is part of that leadership, but also he is understood to have then an authority over the entire oasis of Medina.
In Medina, the Prophet continued to offer up revelations to his followers. But the nature of these messages was noticeably different. According to Muslims, the verses now reflected Muhammad's leadership status and added a new element to the message, a practical guide to creating and ruling a society.
The verses are basically about a society that needs regulation. And therefore, the most striking thing about the Medinan period is the laws, or practically all of the legislation that the Quran includes comes from the Medinan period.
The revelations traditionally associated with Medina laid the foundation for Islamic law. They included rules on nearly all aspects of life, from prohibiting alcohol to allowing mothers to nurse for up to 2 full years. The verses provided guidelines for inheritance, gave new rights to the dispossessed like orphans and slaves, and set new rules elevating the status of women in society. But the meaning of some of these laws was not always clear, and many are still debated to this day. A prime example: does the Quran allow polygamy? Chapter 4, verse 3. Marry those women who are lawful for you, up to 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you cannot be equitable, then only one. At first glance, this verse seems straightforward, but scholars point out that such verses can be interpreted in different ways.
Some say this means you can have 4 wives. Some say it only means you can have one because you can never treat more than one person equally with another person. Some say that it refers only to a very specific situation when there were a lot of orphaned girls available, and the implication was, well, you got to take care of these orphans. So we have to realize that it's not always easy to read out of the text exactly what the implications are for our time, or for any time.
Inspired by the Quran's message and Muhammad's leadership, all of Medina converted to Islam. The laws handed down in the verses of the Quran became the laws of the city.
It was a community that was run by this revelation that was constantly coming forth from Muhammad's mouth. This was a living, breathing, constantly evolving revelation.
That revelation would soon give the Muslims permission to take up arms as a means of survival. The Meccans still had a bounty on the Prophet's head for preaching against their religious practices and threatening the fabric of their economy. And they were not about to tolerate Muhammad's new position as a head of state in Medina. In the year 622, the Meccans declared war on Muhammad and his followers. Just as it said the Quran had given them laws when the community needed order, now it gave them a directive to defend themselves against their attackers. Chapter 2, verse 190. And fight for the cause of God, those who fight you, but do not be aggressive. Surely God does not like the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from wherever they drove you out. Today, these verses, known as the sword verses, are some of the Quran's most striking and controversial passages. Those who argue that the Quran promotes violence turn to these verses to support their claims. But the lines tend to be more complex than simple battle cries.
The Quran says, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Well, this is within a context in which the Muslims are under siege, they have enemies, and the Quran is saying, you know, fight your enemies. You have a right to fight the enemies of God. The Quran also says, when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is merciful, remember that, you know, warfare is not the primary way that you should go.
Fueled by the revelations, the Muslims spent 8 years fighting the Meccans in battles all across the Arabian Peninsula. Then, in the year 630, the Muslims launched an attack, leading an army of 10,000 to the town of Mecca. The city surrendered. Tradition holds that, true to the Quran's instructions, Muhammad was merciful in victory, granting amnesty to everyone in the city. Once the Meccans were defeated,